One of the discussions I've been having for a while now with a multitude of people across multiple different platforms is defining the difference between subjective opinion and objective analysis. Here on Booktube especially, there is a constant misunderstanding between what is objective fact and what is subjective opinion, and it makes it difficult to discuss books with any depth because people are unsure how to take in the information they're given. My intention here, starting in October, is for me to critique rather than simply review books, to go for a deep dive analysis and discuss the various aspects of the books in detail. So it's in my interest now to establish what is and isn't objective, largely because far more of my criticisms are going to be objective criticism than people may realise. Some things I say will be objective statements, but not necessarily criticism, and others will be openly subjective, but hopefully in such a way that you'll be able to understand the reason for my critique and use that information to decide whether it will be relevant for yourself. So let's use an example that is likely to be one we all know well. It's probably one of the most popular books on YouTube right now, so it's likely one that you're familiar with. Still, there will be no spoilers in this video, so you don't need to worry. Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings is a book I've been reading recently, as many people on Booktube have, in anticipation for the fourth book in the Stormlight Archives coming later this year. While it would clearly be subjective to describe whether or not I like this book, many of the things I can say about this book are objective facts. Here is a short example review excerpt that is entirely objective. Way of Kings is a truly enormous book, at over 1,000 pages in almost any print edition. With the exact number of pages changing depending on format, it can be an intimidating read for many. Word count wise, it's over 384,000 words long, making it larger than the entire Hunger Games trilogy. The book uses that length to allow for a structure few books can pull off. Way of Kings has not one, not two, but 4 cold openings with almost nothing clearly linking them. A prelude, prologue, and then the first 2 chapters, each of which follow a different primary character. It will be 60 pages in by the time you finish these 4 chapters, which in any other book is a significant amount of the book. This pacing is a sign of things to come, as the next 35 chapters are almost entirely build-up, character development, and setting exploration. It also introduces a third main character and multiple other side perspectives during the interlude chapters, which are side stories woven into the main story that presumably add context to the greater story arcs. The narrative does move forward, but it does so at a snail's pace, with the first half of this book being extremely ponderous and reflective of the characters. It is fair to say that one of the most defining aspects of Brandon Sanderson's writing style in the Stormlight Archives is his pacing. While some are going to love the attention spent on world building and character work, others are going to find this frustratingly slow. That section of a review was entirely objective. Every statement and every judgment that I made there is accurate and cannot be contested. If you argue The Way of Kings isn't slow-paced, you are simply wrong. There is no discussion or debate to be had. This is a fact, an objective fact. The subjective aspect to this, however, is whether the slow pace is a good thing or not. Notice that in the previous section I never described whether or not it was a good thing. While I described it as slow, I never gave a value judgment. I said some will love it, some will find it frustrating, acknowledging the possible subjective perspectives that are likely to come from that creative decision. The majority of my writing is going to be like this. Objective statements with acknowledgements of the subjective takeaways that could be had from it, followed by my personal subjective feelings on how well the aims of the book were fulfilled and how I felt having read it. I will then interject with my personal opinions and what I liked about it. So, for example, with Way of Kings, I like the slow pace because I feel it made it more immersive. And I like that it's more immersive. So far, I suspect people are wondering why this needs to be a video at all. After all, isn't that by definition what a review is? Isn't all critique a mix of objective and subjective points, written in such a way that a listener can decide if they want to experience the same media? Theoretically, it should be, but no, it's not. With the rise of what we call yellow press, people with no formal journalistic training have been going into journalism for a long time now, and review and critique is an aspect of journalism. It is providing a service to people, advising them on how to use their time and money. For those unaware, yellow press is a term used in antiquity during the early adoption of newspapers to refer to the independent yellow-tinted tabloid papers that were produced at the time as a way of distinguishing it from the white broadsheets that were considered more respectable at the time. Those yellow-tinted papers were yellow because they were printed on lower quality paper stock. Without formal training, the yellow press would often print inaccurate and censorial work without fact-checking and without care to journalistic integrity. Not always, but often, and it developed a reputation. The internet has made this more and more of an issue, as it is ludicrously easy for an independent person with a smartphone and a few minutes to spare to suddenly become the next viral sensation and influence the opinions of millions. What this means is hot takes now replace proper reporting, and biased media is now the norm. Don't get me wrong, traditional journalism is hardly the best in this regard either. With journalistic integrity dropping across the board in almost every major network, from ABC and CNN to the BBC to Fox News and every other source you can think of, all these major networks are exhibiting political bias, doing little to fact check, relying on shock media to keep their views up, and this is coinciding with a lack of trained journalists in key positions. When it comes to criticism of media, this is even worse. There are almost no professional critics of media that are actually trained in journalism nowadays. Doesn't matter whether it's book reviews, film reviews, food reviews, or the worst example of the most biased, untrustworthy critique I've ever seen, video game reviews. Everyone involved, even in major publications, what would have been the white broadsheets of our time, will be independent critics without a formal education on the matter. And I say this as someone who is also an independent critic who has no formal education on the matter. My understanding of journalism is entirely self-taught in my spare time over the internet, and I expect to get it wrong on many, many occasions. But where I hope I will stand out is that I acknowledge this fact, and I aim to bring this up regularly so I can be held to account. What this means, especially in media critique, is that we have an industry of nothing but yellow press reporting with no care taken to retain objectivity. Everything now is reviewed through a lens. We don't need the socialist take, or the conservative take, or the feminist take, or the Christian take, or the queer take, or anything else like that. We don't need your take. We need objective, fair, unbiased and critically aware discussions. That is how you take media and elevate it. The fact that so many scores on aggregate sites from Metacritic to Rotten Tomatoes across multiple mediums of entertainment are so radically and hilariously incorrect is a sign of how disconnected, inept and utterly incompetent the average critic really is. They have no idea what they are doing. If they had even a shred of integrity, they would admit that films such as the recent Star Wars films and games such as The Last of Us Part 2 are terrible and would be able to explain why. In some cases, a critic with a sense of integrity can do just that. Jim Sterling, for example, is a great example of a games critic that, despite his clear left-wing political bias, is generally trustworthy and able to critique games reasonably. But he also has a tendency to become overly fixated on his political battles, often obscuring his reviews in comedic rant rhetoric. More often now, a critic is either pushing a political agenda, usually feminism or social justice, as the majority of these publications are sickeningly bipartisan, or they're corporate shills out to line their pockets, or the pockets of a sponsor or corporate interest. Even the better ones fall into this. Booktube embodies this in all the very worst aspects. Criticism on Booktube is laughable for the most part. Almost no one goes into depth when discussing a book, and for good reason. The audience on Booktube doesn't care. They don't want that. The Booktube audience has made it abundantly clear what they want. They want to see lists of book titles. Just lists of book titles, no context needed. They want to see book hauls, TBRs, wrap-ups, bookshelf tours, and very little else. What do all these videos have in common? They're pretty much just someone getting a pile of books, showing them to the camera, making one or two sentence statements about each book. It takes little to no real effort. It doesn't actually require reading the book to do. It can be engaged with frivolously by people who haven't actually read the book themselves. If the same channel posts reviews, though, they drastically underperform, as people don't actually want to see detailed analysis. And so, when these channels do finally attempt to give an analysis, when that analysis is finally given, it's wrought with many issues. Booktube is perhaps the least journalistically sound method of getting criticism there has ever been. Almost every critic in the community is in direct communication with publishers and receives ARCs or advanced reader copies of books. These are sent out to coincide with the book's initial hardback and ebook release, where the majority of profit is to be made. It's in effect one huge advertising campaign. Critics are almost always needlessly positive about every book they read because they don't want to offend the publishers who are providing these ARCs. This is compounded by the fact that the book hasn't in fact released, so audiences haven't read it, and with the current social trend of FOMO, or fear of missing out, people are trained into believing that spoilers will ruin anything they've yet to experience, so any detailed reviews will never succeed. This leaves us with only one avenue they can go down. Every review now needs to be a bland, non-specific, vague, yet positive coverage of the book with no spoilers. And because there's almost no substance there, people grasp at anything they can comment on, which often leads to the things I've previously made fun of. Excessive discussion on how pretty the front cover is will often make up a significant portion of the review. This will usually be followed by virtue signalling about how the author is black, gay, trans, or a woman where appropriate, and praise for the book for being woke by including a black, gay, trans, or feminist-approved female character. Finally, the book will either be rated a 4 or 5 star, and it is always either a 4 or 5 star. An aggregate rating on Goodreads below 3.5 stars on this 5-star system is considered dirt, to the point where the lowest rated book you likely own will probably have an aggregate score above 3 stars. Feel free to check, I'll wait. In reality, book reviews should be so much more. You should start by describing the genre and theme. These are the most vitally important things to bring up because they're entirely subjective aspects of the book. A sci-fi dystopian novel about the dangers of intelligent AI integrated into social media, for example, might sound like a really interesting book to one person and a boring waste of time to another, and both are entirely justified positions. Not every book is designed to appeal to every person, and genre and theme, as well as targeted age range, are all designed to indicate the intended audience. If someone other than the intended audience is reviewing the book, they need to be aware that they're reviewing something not meant for them. As much as I rail against YA books for being somewhat vapid, I am very quick to defend YA for being vapid in some respects, because YA does something adult books can't do. It allows for the protagonist and the main characters to behave like idiots, because the protagonist and main characters are almost always teenagers. You can have a cast of predominantly teenagers acting in foolish ways because that's how teenagers think. And that's reasonable. You can't do that in an adult book. It's why YA can have storylines that seem so contrived to most adults, but it works. I defend those choices because they fit the medium. There are other things in YA I don't defend. Those things I will come to when we get to those books. Once you've established your target audience, you then need to discuss other things such as narrative structure, character development, world building, pacing, prose. These are the key parts of your book, with some being diametrically opposed to others. You can't, for example, have a fast-paced book with an exciting plot, florid prose, detailed world building, and great character development. There is simply not enough space in the book to do all of those things. As soon as you attempt to include character development and world building and focus on stylistic prose, you will necessarily have tanked the pacing of your book, and you now need 3 times as many pages to describe anything that happens in the plot, which means the plot will have suffered as well. An author can only focus on some aspects of writing, and an attempt to focus on them all will necessarily fail. This is a factual limitation of the medium. A critic's job is to explain how well they succeed in the areas they attempt to focus on, and to explain which areas they're focusing on and in what manner. That's what I hope to do. So far, all of this has been objective. Not a single part of a criticism that would follow what I outlined before would need to reference subjective tastes. It will reference subjective tastes because that adds context to make the critique more interesting and personable, but it doesn't need to. Additionally, I will be working to be clear in my criticism as to when I'm offering an opinion. Finally, and this is a thing that I promise to the community right now, I have no interest in selling my opinions. As I said in my previous video, I won't be accepting payment, sponsorship, or hell, even accepting ARCs. No matter how popular my content becomes, or doesn't become for that matter, I won't be interviewing authors or talking directly to publishers. I have no interest in doing this. As the saying goes, never meet your heroes. I don't want to meet these people because I don't want my perceptions of them to change. As much as it's nice to see these authors engaging with their community, as soon as I befriend an author, my objectivity will be called into question. I don't want to have people wondering if I'm altering my opinion, but I also don't want to upset authors that I may befriend if I do meet them. I want to stay as detached as possible. I want to enjoy the medium, and I want to leave the creative people to be creative. My bias is already going to be affected. The fact is, I already know more than I want. I already know a lot about these people just from their social media, from watching interviews. I know who they are as people. I can see what they're like. I know, for example, that Brandon Sanderson is a likeable, friendly Mormon. That is going to influence me. I like him as a person. Does that mean I'm going to give his books a better review? Maybe. Does it mean I'm going to be harsher because I might overcompensate because I know I like him as a person? Maybe. I don't know which way I could go. I could be overly harsh or overly nice. And I'm going to have to be very aware of this and actively try to stop myself. I also know that Philip Pullman is an outspoken atheist, and that he likes to include anti-religious theming in his books. And as an outspoken atheist myself, I approve of and like that element of his books. That's a very obvious bias. Am I going to do the same for him? Am I going to give him positive reviews because I know that he includes an element I openly support? Or will I be overly critical of him in order to overcompensate for the fact that I already go in with a positive bias? Again, I don't know. I'm going to have to be very, very careful to watch my biases here. And this is from people I've never met and never spoken to. if I met these people, if I interviewed them, if I received gifts from them, if I spoke to their publishers and got their books for free, how on earth could I ever be expected to review their media objectively without people questioning my objectivity? Honestly, there's only two ways you can approach this. Either you have to be as separated as possible from the media, or you have to go into this with the presumption that you're already biased regardless, and that it doesn't matter what happens, it doesn't matter if this is your closest friend, you're going to try your best to be objective and just announce any involvement you may have with the creator up front and hope that you can account for it in your review, both positively and negatively. I'm going to try and do the latter. I don't want to meet these people because I don't want to meet my heroes, because I don't want to change my perspective. I think that that will ruin the media for me. But if, for example, I happened to be at a convention and Brandon Sanderson was sitting at a table, I wouldn't hesitate to go up and shake his hand and say, he's written some books I enjoy, maybe get him to sign one. That would be fine. That would not be a mark against my objectivity, because I would tell you about it, and I would make a point to try not to let that affect how I would judge a book he wrote, both positively or negatively, because it could go either way. Very few people have the integrity to think about these things anymore, and that's a problem. So that's what I have to say on objectivity versus subjectivity. I hope it was interesting and gave you an insight into my intentions going forward. I know for a select few in the community, the lack of deep, unbiased critique is a big pet peeve. I hope I can address this, and I look forward to your feedback. Until next time, thanks for watching.